I know this is an intimate crowd of people who are very familiar with the Powels and landmarks, so I apologize in advance if this is anything you already know. So I look forward to questions too. I love the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and take it away. So the title of my talk is Compliments of the Day, Happy Birthday, Mrs. Powell and Mr. President. So the reason why we chose the birthday theme to kind of make this the overarching theme is that Elizabeth Powell and George Washington were born 10 years and 1 day apart. So it's kind of cool because they have that connection, and actually George Washington's birthday was on Monday and Elizabeth Powell's was on Sunday. So how fitting that we get to talk about them just so close after their birthdays. And both of them had big celebrations for their birthdays. George Washington had one every year in multiple cities. Elizabeth Powell at least had one in 1793. So I want to go ahead, and you all know who Elizabeth Powell is, and you all know who George Washington is, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. But I want to go ahead and show this first slide that's going to be about her birthday. So this is, of course, the beautiful picture of the ballroom at Powell House. And this, in 1793, Elizabeth Powell threw a ball for her 50th birthday, and it was quite an affair. So she and Samuel were very well known for their entertainment and of course, their political conversations and get-togethers and things like that, but they very much were known for throwing good parties and balls. And actually, it's partially because, well, not only were they just very good entertainers and wealthy, but they were one of the only people in Philadelphia to have a ballroom in their house. So that also, just in true spatial importance, was why some of these people started gathering there. So by 1793, they were well known for their parties, of course. So Elizabeth Powell herself was very, very popular by this point in Philadelphia. It was kind of her peak of her place in society. She's turning 50. She's kind of this like top of her game. And so of course, what thing better to do than throw a birthday party? So this actually is a quote, 2 stanzas of a poem that was given to Elizabeth Powell by George Washington. So that title, Compliments of the Day, comes from a note from George Washington and Martha Washington to Elizabeth Powell that was given to her because they sadly had to turn down attending her party. So instead, he sends her that nice note, but then also sends her a poem alongside of it. So the poem was written by Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. And since I know you all are Philadelphians, you might be familiar with Graham Park. Graham Park is Elizabeth Graham Ferguson's former home. So Elizabeth Graham Ferguson was also this very powerful Philadelphia woman. She was a poet. She hung out with a lot of other really important authors and had her own literary salon network. But of course, they knew Elizabeth Powell and were very, very much respected Elizabeth Powell. There's some neat letters from another poet really singing Elizabeth's praises, and she writes her a couple of poems. But I wanted to include this one because this is from George Washington. And I think it's such a neat poem because it kind of sets the scene for what the party that they were going to throw for her. And I love that second stanza about a joyous evening shall be spent, and old and young agree to mark the hour which time has lent to hail the jubilee. So it's kind of neat because the poem is, of course, dated February 21st, 1793. So I think that at this party, these poems would have been read to her. So I think that's kind of cool too. And I'll show you on the next slide a couple of little clips of other poems. But this one is really fun because you think about, even though George Washington couldn't be at her party, a part of him was still there through this poem. And this portrait, this is the portrait that Mount Vernon has recently acquired. This is Elizabeth Powell painted likely by Joseph Wright, the artist Joseph Wright. who painted a portrait of George Washington that the Powells owned. And I'll show that at the end of the talk. But this is unfinished, and it's likely because Joseph Wright died of the yellow fever epidemic in end of 1793. So we think this is dated around that time, actually because of her hairstyle. Her hairstyle matches a family portrait done by Joseph Wright, matches his wife's hair. So it dates to that era, but it adds, you know, kind of an interesting snapshot to what she looked at the time that this was all going on. And you know, thinking of this party happening in the ballroom, and it's described as being a brilliant display, and the party was opened with her and the French minister dancing a minuet, and she was wearing blue silk with squirrel fur trim. So it's very interesting to think of all of that in one setting. So, oh, also, I can't forget, not only did he say compliments of the day, many more, but he said about, Washington said on the poem itself in very Washington fashion, his pleasant comments on the poem were that the enclosed thoughts are well conceived, the sentiments are just. So it is a very Washington, very, very short and to the point, but very nice. So this is another poem that was read to her at her party. This is actually, I'm just going to briefly go through it, but it's the reason why I included it is that Mr. Hill is Henry Hill. So Hill Physic, as you all know, of course, has the tie of Henry Hill. So the Powells were friends with Henry Hill. So I'm not surprised that there was a poem written by him initially. And then to me, it also shows kind of how the network worked in Philadelphia and how all these people knew each other, like Henry Hill, George Washington, Elizabeth Powell, all of these people are interacting in the same circles, which is really fun. And they would have all been at her party. And so to transition, I want to go, of course, to George Washington himself, and keeping with the birthday theme, almost unintentionally, and the dancing theme. This is a quote from Sarah Franklin Bache, who is Benjamin Franklin's daughter, to Benjamin Franklin from January 1779. And you may have seen this quote before. This is actually the first time the Powells and the Washingtons are mentioned in the same place at the same time. However, they most likely would have met before this, but this is just the first documented time. So the Powells threw a party, likely a 12th night ball. It just was a happy coincidence that it was also George Washington's 20th wedding anniversary. And the Washingtons came, and Washington was headquartering in Philadelphia. So they would have been, of course, needing some entertainment, and what better place to go than the Powells? So he and Sarah Franklin Bache danced together, and it was a very clearly fun affair. And again, just another example of the Powells and their entertainment. So, and then of course, this image is the ballroom at the PMA. But I really love being in the ballroom at Powell House, because you really get the full effect of seeing the light streaming in and the floor. And even if the woodwork is not the original, it looks just beautiful, and it's just a really neat space to be. So I think a couple of you, I know Fiona mentioned beforehand that someone was very excited about the Republic If You Can Keep It quote. So I did want to talk about that because even though it doesn't necessarily involve George Washington directly, it does involve Dr. Franklin, who I mentioned in the last slide. But this, in a way, even if George Washington wasn't here for this specific conversation, he very much would have been listening to conversations just like this and participating in conversations just like this. So this quote comes from a whole line of different stories. This is actually my favorite version because it brings up Elizabeth Powell specifically, and it talks about Dr. Franklin entering the room. In other ones, it just says, a lady asked Dr. Franklin. But this one, to me, rings the most true to how I think this conversation would have unfolded. So I think it's also very cool that she is so important that Benjamin Franklin met with her. So that this just, represents one example of the many times these people were gathering at the Powells, and that Elizabeth herself was participating in these conversations. She was not just there hosting and everyone else is in a flurry of conversation around her. She clearly was actively participating in these conversations. So that just is fascinating to me. And I think it really proves, and this is a very dreamy thing that I think about, but even though she wasn't, directly in the political world, she wasn't at the convention herself. I'm sure that even if it wasn't consciously, some of her ideas that she probably mentioned to these men very well could have influenced them in how they framed the Constitution. So she just is incredibly important, and this quote really shows it. So I guess I should explain, this all comes from the Constitutional Convention. So the conversation itself, Elizabeth has some commentary on. It is supposedly at some point, like the day after they signed the Constitution, Dr. Franklin came, she asked him about the Constitution, and then that was it. But this was her commentary on the subject. And I think it's very cool because this phrase has come up in the media a lot lately. So it's almost like we have this, it's like a celebrity type thing, and we have her commentary on it, even though it's from 200 years ago. So she says she's embarrassed, and I know some people have interpreted that as though she is embarrassed that people at all thought she was doing this. But I think it's more that she may not have been, this exact conversation might not have happened as it's portrayed. And I think also to her in 1787, this was just going on. This wasn't some kind of anecdotal thing. This wasn't just some sort of like flashpoint. Like the convention went on for months. So I think the fact that she says at the end, I well remember to have frequently associated with the most respectable, influential members of the convention that framed the Constitution, and that the all-important subject was frequently discussed at our house, is very telling. That to me shows that, of course, all of these men were there. So even if the conversation of what do we have, a republic, madam, if you can keep it, didn't happen, there could have been a number of other conversations that happened in its place. And of course, George Washington would have been listening and participating in all those conversations. So to go back to George Washington, and actually to go back to my favorite example of her and her power in the political world of Philadelphia. And she was, of course, participated in the founding of the country, but she also participated and had a hand in continuing the country. So this letter, this is a clip of a letter that she wrote in 1792, November 4th, right at the end of George Washington's first term. So she was, of course, very good friends with Washington, and Washington had been anxious about serving a second term. He had been in politics a long time and was really ready to go home, at the detriment, in Elizabeth's mind, to society. So this letter is amazing. It's the only example of someone outside of Washington's cabinet talking with him about his anxieties about running for president again. And not only is it someone outside of his cabinet, it's the only woman. So this is just a really important flashpoint in her life and in the importance of her and George Washington's friendship, because she really, by writing this very intense letter to the President of the United States on the